Hey everybody, Zack at SEAS here, taking over for Troy this week, and we've got something a little different. I really want to talk about what is an ideal event schedule, and I'm not just talking about on site. I think most people who are in show business understand the basics of what it takes to put a successful show together on site. But I think something that often gets overlooked or just maybe not known is what happens behind the scenes leading up to the show and then after the show itself, and specifically from the vantage point of an AV company like us. So the schedule I put together, this is just a rough outline, and not every show is the same. But the thing to keep in mind is, as we talk through these timelines, that the bigger your show is, the more time you're going to need. And the smaller the show is, the less time you'll need. Now, all of these things we're going to talk about need to still happen, but you can adjust your timeline accordingly. So let's get into it. So in the very beginning here, we're talking probably 9 to 12 months out. What we're looking for as the AV company is just the basics. We want to know, is the show happening? What are the dates? Where is it at? Very broad scope of what's happening. Is it just audio? Are we doing, turnkey audio, lights, video? About how many people are coming? Is there going to be a general session, exhibit hall, 10, 20 breakouts? Just the gist of it. We don't need to get into the specifics or even concepts. I don't need to see diagrams, but the point here is we want to get basically our guys booked right away. So it's just kind of our philosophy that the most crucial part to any show is having the right people there. You can get gear a lot of different places. If we need to sub-rent something, obviously we have a pretty big inventory of gear ourselves, but that really comes secondary, and it changes as the event flows. What doesn't change in terms of availability or skill set is the people available. So what we really want to do is make sure right off the bat we know enough about the show to get the right people booked on the job. So next phase, about let's say 6 to 9 months before the show, this is where we want to learn a bit more about what's going on. So we're going to start talking concept, maybe do some diagrams or renderings. We may want to go do a site visit, especially if this is a place that we haven't been very often or in a while or ever. Then we're going to want to talk more specifically about the scope, right? So it's audio, and this is what that looks like. This is how many wireless. The lighting is going to be a stage wash and backlight. Video, we're going to do projection screens or LED. It's going to be this size. We want to add iMac. We want to know enough about this basically to get to a budget is what we're shooting for here, right? We want to get from you, what your budget is, your target budget, and then we want to basically align what you're trying to do with that budget. And that all happens about 6 to 9 months out. Next, at about the, let's say, 3 to 6 month mark, we want to start talking logistics. And basically the thing to know here is, there's a lot of variable costs. There's, if it's a traveling show, flights go up and down, hotels go up and down, even gear to some degree goes up and down depending on when the show is and how soon you book it. So what we really want to dial in here is in that 3 to 6 month window is start to get all those logistics booked, assuming of course we know the budget and we've got that all dialed. But we want to take advantage of the lowest rates possible for all the logistics and have enough time to resource the gear, not waiting till the last month or two to try and find a piece of gear in what could be a very busy month, and therefore having to pay a premium for that, where if we would have booked it 3 or 6 months out, we might have been able to find a better deal. Also in this time frame, this is probably about the time we're going to ask for a first deposit, and basically as we start booking things, incurring expenses, that's when we're going to ask for a deposit. It may not be 50%, 25%. It kind of just depends on the size of the show. But generally, the more out-of-pocket expenses that there are on a show, the bigger the deposit is going to be. When we get inside, let's say that 3 month window, this is typically where we want to start having content in hand. We realize all throughout the process there's probably going to be changes, but this is where we really want to start to dial things in. So about 1 to 3 months, we want to be working on content. I like to avoid the situation where we're being handed content, a day or two before the show, and we don't have any time to proof it. Make sure that the file formats and the resolutions are correct and all those things. We that does take time. So worst case, we like to have all content in hand a week or two before the show so we can run through it all. But the other things we're doing in this last month is we're basically on our end finalizing all this stuff. We're making sure that the gear is spec'd correctly. Internally, we have our own technical people that will run through the gear list, making sure that everything is accounted for to fulfill the scope being talked about. Realize there's going to be schedule changes probably from the beginning when we were talking about the show up until it. So we're changing the just making sure that's correct. And then, like I said, we're running through content to make sure basically when we show up on site, everything is dialed. So that's a pretty good, I think, summary of the stuff that happens before show. So let's talk about the stuff that happens on show. And I just want to point out maybe a few things that maybe people don't think about. Starting with load-in. Okay, so load-in is, when all the gear and people show up, they push all the stuff into the rooms and we're setting up. And so the thing I want to point out here is that we really like to have a day before things actually need to happen, rehearsal, show, whatever it is, to get everything set up and tested, especially on the bigger shows. And that could be multiple days. So it's like a full-blown trade show or a huge corporate show with, 50 breakouts, general session, exhibit hall. We're going to need more time for load-in. And it's really because on any show, as most of you know, there's so many things that can change once you show up on site. That we try to plan for, but ultimately it's very rare, I would say, for a show to go 100% according to plan exactly how you planned it. Especially if you're traveling, right? You could have a truck that breaks down or somebody misses a flight, and not even just talking about us. It could be presenters that are coming and they miss their flight to rehearse their keynote, or the venue doesn't have the room available at the time they told you it's going to be available. There's really infinite things that could happen. So having that preload day as a buffer to really make sure everything's dialed is really helpful. So that's the first thing. The next thing that generally happens once everything is loaded in, tested, set up, is we really like to have a rehearsal. Now, I do feel like rehearsals sometimes get overlooked. And I would say there's two types of rehearsals. And the first one is a tech rehearsal where really it's just crew and maybe the client or producer running through all the content, making sure everything displays correctly, sounds correct, and is in the right order. And sometimes this gets overlooked. So sometimes on shows, the first rehearsal we do is with talent and they're expecting everything to be perfect. But we have to remember is, especially on the big shows, you may have a crew of 20 plus people and they're not just working on your show, right? They may have been on the road for weeks coming up to this show, and this may be the first time that, everybody collectively is looking at the content. So you really want to give them the opportunity to get familiar with it, and that is the point of the tech rehearsal. So preferably after everything's set up, we do a tech rehearsal, and then once that's done, everything's dialed in order, formatted correctly, then we're ready for a rehearsal with the talent. Generally, the next thing that happens is the show itself after rehearsals. After everything's ready to go, rehearsals the show happens next. And we're not going to talk cue to cue or how to structure your show. I would say most of them are kind of the same once you get to that point in terms of flow, right? You've got maybe cocktails, doors, a program, that's like, I don't know, it's pretty standard, I would say. But some of the things I want to point out here when you're building your show schedule to keep in mind, and really this is to just, I guess, help minimize any unforeseen cost, is some of the labor, rules to keep in mind, right? So first off, depending who you're working with, what state you're in, your crew may be working on an 8 or 10 hour workday. And whether it's 8 or 10, basically they need to be fed by the fifth working hour, every fifth working hour. So if they're working 10 hours, by hour 5, you've got to feed them or you got to cut them for an hour, walk away. A lot of times that's not possible when you're in the middle of the show. So the easiest thing tends to be to provide them a meal. If you don't, you might incur what they call meal penalty, which is basically double billing of whatever rate you're in at the time that it happens. So for instance, if your crew is in straight time because they're working hour 5 to 6 and they're not able to get a meal break, then that 1 hour between 5 and 6, you're going to get billed 1 hour of straight time and then an additional hour of straight time for the meal penalty up until they're actually able to take a meal break. And so that can get really costly depending on where, how many technicians there are. And let's say you're already in OT, and so the meal penalty occurs at that 10th to 11th hour or 11 to 12, or maybe they're in double time. So it's just something to keep in mind. A lot of times crew, for whatever reason, don't get thought about in terms of meals, and we just want you to keep that in mind so that this doesn't become, like I said, an unforeseen expense. Another thing to keep in mind with the schedule is if you've got a lot to do, it's a long day, there's a thing called turnaround time. So if your crew doesn't get 8 hours off between shifts, then the whole next day starts in OT and goes up from there. So let's say loading doesn't go as fast as you're hoping, and the crew is not cut until 1 a.m. and their callback is 8 a.m. the next morning. That's only 7 hours off. They're going to be in turnaround time, and that is going to be, like I said, at about 50% higher than it would be if it were straight time. The other thing to think about is the loadout itself. If it's already a long day, right? We've done, maybe this show is loaded in the morning, do the show, and then you've got loadout scheduled immediately after. This could end up being a 16, 17, 18-hour day. One thing you may want to take a look at is whether it makes sense to cut the crew at the end of the show, bring them back the next day, because everybody could be in double time or whatever at that point. And it's not just the rate itself, it's also a safety thing, right? You've got a bunch of people at that point, 16, 17 hours in, moving heavy equipment. It does become a liability potentially if those guys are tired and get hurt. So it's just another thing to think about. So after the show, we really like to do a debrief with our clients. Like I said earlier, it's really rare for everything on a show to go perfect. There's just there's infinite variables. So what we really like to do is sit down, do a brief debrief, talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, and basically just make adjustments if, especially if we're going to do the show again next year, to better prepare for the next one based on what happened the previous show. Now, internally, we already do this. Every show we do a post-show report where, as a team, we're discussing all of these things, what went well, what didn't, who the rock stars on the crew were and whatnot, to make sure, we're always doing the best job we can. But sometimes that debrief doesn't happen with the client. And I would say, both for us and for a client, that information can be really valuable. So we really like to have a post-show debrief. The other thing I want to talk about post-show is just the money side of things, which is basically we like to pay all of our vendors, our people, as fast as possible. And if possible, try to take care of your AV companies as soon as they can. They may not have the means to do that until they get the final balance on a show, especially if it's really big. And so the faster you pay them, the faster they can pay all the people that worked on your show. And generally, the faster people get paid, the happier they are. Couple things I want to point out here, and we'll wrap on this, which is maybe not so specifically related to the schedule itself, but things you can keep in mind when you're scheduling your event. So in our business, there are busy and slow months, and the busiest months tend to be, depending on the industry or segment you're in, right? Corporate versus touring or whatever. In our line of work, which tends to be corporate and gala, and mostly the stuff that's in ballrooms, the busiest months tend to be February through June, and then it picks up again, usually September, up until the Thanksgiving break. So if you haven't booked your event and you're looking for a space, those are going to be the months where it's harder and probably more expensive to book a space. Also, the travel accommodations are probably going to be a little more. And so if you have the flexibility, it might make sense to look at the off months, which are usually like January, July, August, late November and December. If that's possible, you might be able to find a better deal on the venue itself. You may be able to find a better deal even with us, the AV company, because we're going to have more availability. So if you're flexible, that's something you can take a look at. And the last thing I want to point out here too is basically unrelated to schedule. If you're getting bids from a hotel or an AV company, keep in mind all this is negotiable. So if you can be flexible maybe in your ask or whatever, know that you can go back to these companies, even the hotels, and you can negotiate with them to get, a better deal. Or like I said, if you're flexible with the schedule itself or the equipment being requested, and allow them to use what makes most sense for them from a cost perspective, then you can probably get yourself a better deal as well. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can send me an email, z.grant@seaspro.com. You can also go to our website, seaspro.com. We've got a whole page dedicated to not just these podcasts, but other resources that we give away, and a blog that I recently kicked back up again, where we just kind of discuss various topics that might give you some insight and helpful tips or tricks to just help everything run smoother. Thanks for watching.